Good afternoon, everyone. So again, my name is Jeremy Rhoden. I am the Urban Horticulture Agent for IFAS Extension in Marion County. And I'm going to explain kind of a little bit of my background in hydroponics and how I got into this role, not only with IFAS, but also in my previous career working with hydroponics. And then I'll go over the different types of hydroponic systems and how they work and how they function. I'll show you some pictures that we've taken over time. And if you have questions at the end, you're more than welcome to ask. We'll go over quite a bit today, and I'll try to do so all within the hour. I normally do this presentation in about 2 hours, and that's primarily because I get a ton of questions along the way, which is why we've asked to hold them off to the end. But hopefully, I'll answer all those as we go. So, just a little bit about me. Give you a background. I've been with Extension now, with UFIFAS Extension for about 4 years, excuse me, now. And prior to my time being here as the urban horticulture agent, I worked for Marion County Public Schools for about a decade. And my role there, I initially started as a high school agriculture teacher. And during my time there as a teacher for 4 years, I created a partnership with the Marion County Hospital District. And that program essentially, it's still going on to this day. It was our version of Farm to School. We called it FANS, which is Fitness and Nutrition in Schools. And our high school was the first of the 7 high schools in Marion County to get a brand new state-of-the-art greenhouse. The greenhouse is 6,000 square feet, and it has about 14 different hydroponic systems in there, 6 of which are commercial style systems. And to this day, it is the largest school greenhouse in the state. In addition to that, we also had about 5,000 square feet of outdoor vegetable gardening that were in raised beds and in-ground gardens. And we also had some outdoor hydroponic systems that we were using as well. So we were using a combination of both commercial systems as well as hobbyist style systems. Fast forward, after I did that for 4 years, we started putting these greenhouses in all of the different high schools. All 7 high schools and 11 middle schools got hydroponic greenhouses, and all 32 of our elementary schools received raised beds, and all of the food that they were growing in those gardens were going directly into the school's cafeteria for student lunches, and then also being sent home with families to have access to fresh produce. So that's kind of my background in that. And so I did that for about 10 years. And of course, during that time, I worked with a lot of UF master gardeners. And that kind of opened an opportunity for me to transition over into the UF IFA side, where I have still been teaching hydroponics, but primarily on a hobbyist or homeowner level, not so much in the larger commercial scale. So I'm going to kind of share with you different things that you can do at home, but some of the photos you see today are going to be from either the greenhouses or from what we're doing here on site. Or also, I've done some volunteer research, or excuse me, volunteer uh, opportunities with the UF IFAS hydroponic research facility, which is up in Live Oak at the Swanee Valley Agricultural Center. And so if you haven't ever had a chance to go there, they do an annual day once a year where they invite the public to come out and see all of their hydroponics and their greenhouses. And it's a phenomenal event. And I highly encourage you to go out there and do that. If you can find that all on Facebook, if you search for their page. So moving along, first off, what are hydroponics? So, put simply, it's growing plants in a soilless media. Oftentimes, people think of hydroponics as either growing plants with fish involved or growing plants in a liquid solution of some sort. And while growing plants in a liquid solution can be a type of hydroponics, it certainly is a type of hydroponics, that's not the only thing that is hydroponics. And so you're going to see examples here today of plants that are being grown in different types of growing media, or media is another word for like the substrate that they're growing in. And this can include perlite, and perlite are like those little white balls that you see mixed into bags of potting soil when you buy soil at the store. It looks like little white styrofoam balls, but that's actually a volcanic rock called perlite. And it does 2 things. It's really great at providing aeration in the media, and it's also really great at, ironically, holding moisture as well. And so it works really well for a hydroponic media. So we will fill containers full of perlite, strictly perlite, and grow plants out of that as a media. Likewise, another thing we will use are rice hulls. And rice hulls are basically the little shells that every grain of rice grows in. So every single one of them grow in that. And that used to be a waste product that would be sent to landfills. And now we use that as an alternative to perlite, because perlite's dust can be very dangerous to breathe in. Rice hulls is a little safer to work with, but has a very similar consistency in terms of growing plants in it and works really well as a hydroponic media. The next one down is coconut core. This is the husk of a coconut. Oftentimes you'll see coconut core, or also cocoa core as we call it, mixed into soil bags just because it does provide really great water holding capacity. But when you're using cocoa core by itself, it is completely soilless and it makes a phenomenal hydroponic media. We have another one called steel wool. These are little cubes that you can buy that are pre-shaped that you can just put seeds in and grow in those. And then those steel wool cubes can be divided apart and planted in hydroponic systems. We have expanded clay pellets, which you probably have seen those online. When you look up DIY hydroponic systems, they're just little round clay balls. The one thing about those that are nice is that they are reusable, so you can reuse that, whereas all the other things you see listed here are generally not reusable. We normally do not reuse hydroponic medias. But the clay pellets can be used, but really their only purpose is to provide structural support for the plant to stand it up. It doesn't really do much more than that. And then the last two things on there are composted pine bark and play sand. I'm not going to talk too much about these today, but you are going to see photos of these today. Composted pine bark is basically if you go buy a truckload of pine bark from somewhere, the bottom of that pile, there's going to be a whole bunch of dust. And that composted pine bark actually can be really good being used as a hydroponic media as long as it has not composted so much that it starts to gain a nutrient value. So one of the key things about hydroponic medias is it's not only completely soilless, but it's also completely nutrientless. And that's because you're going to control all the nutrients that the plants receive during the feeding and irrigation cycle when you water those plants. So I am going to show you pictures today of how that pine bark is currently being used in hydroponics. And then the last thing on there is play sand. And the reason I list this last is because if you know anything about soils, if any of you have ever participated in any type of soil science, you know that all soils across the entire world are made up of three types of soil particles, and that is sand, silt, and clay. And that kind of goes against the idea of hydroponics. If hydroponics is supposed to be completely soilless media, then how is sand listed in there? Well, play sand has actually been modified by mankind to not hold, or excuse me, not have the same function as traditional sand that you would find in the wild. So I want you to think about when you sit on the beach versus sticking your hand in a sandbox or kid's toy box or so with sand. It's a very different texture sand. The play sand has actually been modified to have rounded edges. So every soil particle in that, every sand particle has rounded edges. So it has become much softer and therefore it holds liquid solution very well. Whereas traditional sand is very coarse and has sharp edges and water drains through it very well. So play sand acts completely opposite than our natural sand, and so therefore we consider play sand in a hydroponic media that can be used for growing, and you're going to see where it's used in these photos today. In fact, if you've ever been through, I know some of you mentioned Epcot in the comments, if you've ever been through the land ride at Epcot, it's a boat ride that rides through their greenhouses where they're growing a whole bunch of vegetables for all of the restaurants in the park, which is one of Disney's parks. You will notice when you go into the first greenhouse, there's full-size palm trees and citrus trees and banana trees, coffee plants, just everything, a beautiful landscape of plants in there. It's like you're riding through a beach. It's actually all play sand. And 2 feet underneath that play sand, there are metal grates that collect all the irrigation and leachate that drain from those plants. If you were to look at the base of every plant in there, you'll notice there'll be two emitters, irrigation emitters, and every time an irrigation cycle comes on, it not only waters those plants, but it also provides a nutrient solution to it. And any excess drains down into those grates below where it goes into a big reservoir and it's recharged every so many minutes and then re-irrigated again throughout the day. So that whole entire greenhouse ride that you're going through, even though there are hydroponic systems set up within that greenhouse, the greenhouse itself is designed as a giant hydroponic system. So it's a really unique experience. If you've never had the opportunity to go to that ride at Epcot, I highly encourage it. It's a very educational ride, and they do an hour-long behind the seeds tour, as they call it, all about growing hydroponically. It's a very great program, and you learn a lot. All right, so why hydroponics? So first off, quality soil is not needed. If you've ever grown traditionally, whether in a raised bed or in ground, you know that quality soil can be very expensive. It's not advised to just build a raised bed and just go get, any soil you find from anywhere or any landscape company's soil, bulk soil. That's not normally advised for growing edible plants. You can use that in a landscape for ornamental plants, but it's not normally advised for edible plants because you don't really know what's in that composted soil. So it's normally advised to go and buy quality potting soil bags. And those bags can be very expensive, anywhere from $10 to $20 a bag. And if you're filling a standard 4 foot by 8 foot bed, that can be very expensive, anywhere of $250 or more to get that started. So you don't need quality soil. You get faster growing crops. In fact, your crops grow about 3 times faster hydroponically than they do in ground. They require less space. So if you look at the photo here, this is a photo of butternut lettuce that we are growing, or buttercrunch lettuce that we are growing for the schools. Every single Monday, we harvested 200 heads of lettuce, just like these, that went straight into the cafeteria within an hour from harvest. And all of these here, we were growing in one tower. We could grow 25 heads of lettuce in the amount of space it took to grow 1 head of lettuce in the ground. And that's because we are growing vertically as opposed to horizontally. In fact, our entire greenhouse, 6,000 square feet, could grow the equivalent of 5 acres of crops in it because of the type of systems we are using in the greenhouse. They can also grow anytime, which is really nice. So we have folks who grow hydroponically year round, even indoors. It's very easy to modify them to grow indoors. They can be grown in any location, garages, warehouses. In fact, to this day, the only successful plants that have grown in the International Space Station have been hydroponically grown plants. And to this day, they still grow them and have been for years. Some of the produce that they are eating, actually all of the produce, I believe, that they're eating in the International Space Station is grown in their hydroponic systems that are in the space station itself. So all of that food is being grown hydroponically. It's pretty great. It's pretty awesome. So moving along, it uses less water. Hydroponics use approximately 75% less water than traditional gardening. So if you're giving direct water, direct nutrients, so you're also using less fertilizer as well. So that's all awesome too. In terms of weeding or herbicides, because your plants grow significantly faster than they do in ground, they're pretty much ready to harvest before your pest pressure gets really bad, which means that you have less amount of pesticide needed or less pest control needed prior to harvest. So for example, we've been growing lettuce like this in the towers here for 10 plus years in Marion County at this point. And during this time, we have never used pesticides on any of the lettuce that has gone into the cafeteria. We've never had to. We never get pest pressure built up high enough that we would need a pesticide on it. The only 2 crops that we ever had issues with, actually 3 I should add, that we ever had to use pesticides on in these greenhouses were tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers. And the main reason for those is because they are long-term crops. With the lettuce, we would plant those by seed, and 6 to 8 weeks later, we were harvesting the entire head of lettuce. With your tomatoes, cucumbers, and peppers, you're planting those by seed and growing them out to a seedling and then leaving them in their hydroponic container for almost the entire school year, about 8 to 9 months, which means there's time for pests to build on those plants. They're fruiting plants, so they take a lot more time to grow, and therefore there's time for pests to build on them. But again, you are still harvesting produce from that plant prior to having to use pesticides on them. Eventually, towards the end, we had to use them, but most of the time, it wasn't that much at all. So just keep that in mind. You're also reducing and eliminating the need for, reducing and eliminating the need for weeding and herbicides. So in these towers here, so I mentioned pesticides in terms of insects, but in terms of plants or weeds, I've never had to use herbicides when it comes to hydroponics. So just keep that in mind as well. In fact, I would say this, of course, is enclosed in a greenhouse, but of the 4 or 5 years that I was at the school, I probably pulled 2 weeds from these towers. At all the middle schools, we had these towers set up outside where they did not have any enclosure protecting them. We had mowers that would drive by on a regular basis and blow weed seeds and everything to the plants, and still very minimal work, very minimal weeds ever come in those towers. So it's not to say you won't get them. You certainly can still get them, but it's very minimal. You'll see one, you pull it right out, and you might not see another one for another 6 months. So just keep that in mind. In my opinion, that is a good enough reason to do hydroponics over traditional gardening anytime. But I should also say that I am a big fan of traditional gardening as well. So I do hydroponics because I love it, but I do believe that everybody should know how to grow traditionally as well. Additional reasons for why you'd want to do hydroponics: it reduces or eliminates agricultural runoff. It's very clean. It's easier than growing in the soil because of the fast and the low pest pressures you have with it. It's simple to master growing hydroponically. You don't really have soil-borne pathogens, so you don't have to worry about those because things like nematodes are not present so much in hydroponic media. You're reducing contamination of the crops because you're not having to use as much chemical. And then finally, you can increase the ability to grow crops for specific characteristics. So, what I mean by this is, unlike in the soil, when you have something planted in the soil, you can provide fertilizer to it. Let's say, for example, you give it Miracle Grow. Well, you know what you're giving it to or giving to the plant, but you don't know what's naturally already in that soil in terms of elements. So you have no idea what the plant is consuming from that soil. In hydroponics, you know 100% of everything that plant is consuming. You control all 17 plant nutrients and the quantity of those nutrients that you are providing to the plant. So, what researchers have been able to do is, like researchers in Japan, for example, have been able to create lettuce varieties that have lower sugar content simply by adjusting the ratio of different or nutrient elements that the plant is receiving. So, they're not changing genes, they're not modifying genetics, anything like that with the plant. They're simply altering the nutrition that they're giving it and changing the amounts of what they're giving it. And in return, it's changing the nutrition value the plant has on us humans. Likewise, here in the US, we have a professor with UF IFAS down in South Florida, Dr. Sendoya, who is also doing research on lettuce, where he is experimenting with different lettuce varieties to have a higher nutritious value for us, such as lettuce like romaine lettuce. He's able to look at what nutrition content the lettuce is providing based on the nutrition that's being fed to the plant. So it's a really cool thing that you're able to do those things with hydroponics, whereas you cannot do that with plants that are being grown in the ground. All right, so I mentioned that about fish. So aquaponics is slightly different than hydroponics. Aquaponics is the combination of hydroponics and aquaculture, which is the farming of fish. And unfortunately, this sounds like a really cool concept. In fact, even when you go through that land ride at Epcot, they have a system like this set up. And just in speaking with the director of that ride there, most of the time their crops fail in that system or their fish die in that system. In fact, I've got to explore their greenhouses that are truly behind the scenes with Disney, where they have the replacement plants to replace on the ride, so it never looks like there's dead plants in there. But the idea of it is great. You get an entire homegrown system or homegrown meal in one system. But the logistics of it, it doesn't really work out that simple. And that's because fish and plants need very different pH and they need different nutrient levels. They need different oxygen levels. So ideally, these two things do not work hand in hand very well. In fact, most researchers will tell you it's best if you want to grow fish and you also want to grow plants, have the two systems side by side, even make them look like they're connected if you would like, but do not connect them. It's going to cost you 3 times the amount of money to maintain that type of system and the 3 times the amount of time to maintain it as well. And that's because you have no control over how much waste the fish are producing. And that could cause a huge increase in spike level in your nutrients to your plants, or it can also have a big decrease in that. So it's best to not have those two things connected. Now, there are farms in Florida that are aquaponic farms where they're growing crops and they're growing fish. And the main way they do that is they grow the fish in tanks and they use that same water, but there's a stopping point where the water comes to, that nutrient solution is adjusted the way it needs to be adjusted for the plants, and then it's later cycled through to the plant. Now, you might be asking, well, why would people do that if it takes so much more time and costs much more money to do it? Well, for the longest time in Florida, the only way you could certify hydroponically grown plants as organic is by using fish waste, because of those 17 plant nutrients that plants need, not all of them are available organically, or we can't find all of them organically. So therefore, some of them are going to be synthetic. And therefore, in that sense, that goes against the idea of being organic. Now, I don't know all the legalities behind all of that, but I do know that is no longer a barrier that prevents hydroponic growers from becoming organic. And I do also know that they have new organic hydroponic nutrients that have come out that are fairly new. I have not used any myself, but I do know that there are not stipulations anymore that prevent hydroponic growers from becoming or certified organic. All right, so there are two general types of hydroponics. The first one is open systems, and the second one is closed, and we'll talk about that next. But open system just means that it does not recirculate. There is an open end to it to where it drains. So in this case, you're using a fresh nutrient solution for each irrigation event. The nutrient and pH stay completely consistent throughout the plants. The leachate runs off and generally is collected, or it should be collected. It's easier to maintain and manage because everything stays consistent across the board. The leachate can be recycled to landscape plants or elsewhere. And it requires regulation. And so if you look at the tower that I have pictured here on the right, this black pot on the bottom is called our leachate pot. And what we would do essentially is, I'm going to go back here to show you this picture. If you look at these towers here at the very top, there is a little black hose, and that is where the irrigation cycle would turn on. And the irrigation would drain through those 5 white pots. There's drain holes at the bottom of each one. And when we started seeing irrigation drain from the bottom white pot, we would start a timer, or excuse me, I would start a timer before the irrigation started. Once the irrigation started, I'd let the timer run through, and when I started seeing dripping from the bottom white pot, I would stop my timer and add 10 seconds to that. That would allow me to aim for 10% leachate. And what that does is it allows me to ensure all of my white pots are fully saturated the way they need to be. They can still drain any excess they have, so none of them get root rot or anything of that nature. But that black pot below, we have filled with cocoa coir, another hydroponic media that captures all of that leachate. And we plant plants down there to use that leftover leachate. So those plants are not getting the premium level leachate that they should be getting. They're just getting what's left over, and still plants grow really, really great down there. So in this case, in this picture, we're growing mustard greens. So I've grown almost everything I can think of down there: zucchini, squash, broccoli, cauliflower, carrots, Swiss chard. I don't think I've ever had a plant grow down there that did not grow well just simply living off the leachate. Now, going back to that picture, oftentimes we would use black ground cloth like this, and you could see the white residue on the black cloth. That tells us that it's over leaking, like we have too much nutrient coming through. Now, again, we're already using significantly less fertilizer than what you use traditionally in traditional gardening. So we still want to conserve it. We don't want to have any leachate. We don't want to be responsible for that by any means. So we want to make sure we're controlling this. So this is just something that we are regulating over time and just watching. So this is a good factor to watch for. The second type of system is a closed system. So as it sounds, this is a system that recirculates. So this is great because you are recycling the nutrients, so it can save you a little money. However, larger long-term systems require ongoing check for pH and nutrients. So you have to regularly check your pH and nutrients. And by the way, I'm going to come back to pH in just 1 second. It also, as I mentioned, can be more economically friendly, but it can lead to an abundance of pathogens, especially if you have a small system like this home system you see in this photo here. This is a recirculating system that's a hobbyist system that you can have at home. And that nutrient water, which you probably would only need to change or check every month or so, it can collect some bacteria in there. So it's something you'd want to regularly monitor, especially if it's going to your edible plants. Now, going back to pH really quick, I'm not sure. I normally ask if anybody understands the relationship between pH and growing plants. But I'm going to explain that really quick. So pH plays a significant role in any plant you grow, whether it's a tree, a shrub, your crops, whatever you're growing, roses, whatever it is. pH is the most critical thing that you have to be aware of. So if you're trying to grow grass, your turf grass at home, or a tree, or whatever, if you are not familiar with your pH, you need to get familiar with your pH. And this is why. When the pH is not balanced, it causes a nutrient deficiency with your plants. So if your pH is too low, it locks up all of your macronutrients in the soil. It changes their form in a way that plants cannot absorb them in the roots. If your pH is too high, it changes your micronutrients to be locked up in the soil as well, and so they cannot be absorbed. And so what often happens is people will start seeing symptoms on their plant of a nutrient deficiency. Like they'll even take pictures and look it up, and the app will say, yep, it's short on nitrogen, or it's short on magnesium, or whatever it is. And this results in folks going to buy fertilizer and apply fertilizer to their soil, when in reality, the nutrients are great. They have perfect nutrients already in the soil, or they have sufficient nutrients. It's that it cannot be absorbed by the plants because the pH is off. And oftentimes this leads to over-fertilizing, which then leads to that fertilizer leaching into our aquifer, which then leads to algae blooms and other things in our local waterways. So the most important thing you can do for any of your landscaping or garden is to know your pH. Well, the same way pH works in your landscape, it works the same way in hydroponics. You can have all the nutrients there set to the exact level and everything that's needed. You can give it every bit of nutrients it needs. But if your pH of your water or the pH of your media is not correct or it's not balanced. And when I say balance, we normally look for a range of around 5.5 to 6.8, somewhere around there. If it's not within that range, it's going to either lock up your micros or your macronutrients, and you're going to have nutrient deficiencies. So just keep that in mind. That's why pH is so important and why pH has to regularly be maintained, because it can fluctuate. It's very easy to elevate pH. It's very difficult to lower pH. So when it comes to changing things in your landscape or in hydroponics, you want to be very careful with anything you're adding to amend pH, because you don't want to elevate it too high because it's very difficult to bring it back down. Yes, somebody asked, don't different plants require a different pH level like blueberries and tomatoes? And yes, that is correct. Blueberries, azaleas, they typically like it a little more acidic. And so on that range, we would say like kind of down to like 5.0, we would say is acidic in terms of plants. But going below 5 or anything above 7.7 or higher, those are going to be ranges that are starting to lock up nutrients in the soil. So, but yes, blueberries and azaleas are great examples of two plants that do like it a little more acidic, so they're going to like a lower pH. So, and for how you would elevate pH in a hydroponic system, so there's different things you can buy. It actually has a very unique name. They're called pH up and pH down. And you can go anywhere. You can Google that, Amazon, whatever. You can just search for that name, pH up, pH down. And it's just a solution you get. And it's very inexpensive. And you can add it to your reservoir or to whatever you're growing in. And it would change your pH and help with your pH. And there's other things too. That's just a very common one that a lot of folks, especially in hobbyists or home scale systems, use. So, all right. So, in terms of types of hydroponic systems, I'm going to go over these in pictures in the next few slides, but kind of the most general types are, we're going to start with the easiest ones at the top and ending with the most difficult at the bottom. We have the Kratky wicking system. This is named after Dr. Kratky from the University of Hawaii, who kind of created this concept, and you'll see that in a second. Deep water culture floating system. Both of these are kind of like set it and forget it systems. You'll see they're pretty easy and simple to use. We have media beds, which is where you're using not a liquid solution, but some type of hydroponic media that things are growing in. We have vertical gardens like the towers you've seen earlier pictures, top drip systems where you're providing irrigation from the top, and then also nutrient film technique. Nutrient film technique, commonly called NFT, is the most advanced system. It has the least room for failure, and that's because it is 100% dependent on running electricity and running water. And so we normally recommend this system as a last resort. However, when you search for things like DIY hydroponic on Google, the very first thing that pops up are those 4-inch PVC pipes with netted cups, and that's a type of NFT system. And it's going to be very easy to fail with that system. And unfortunately, that causes people to give up on doing hydroponics because of how little room for failure there is with that. Now, with these systems, the ones that are black are considered closed systems generally, and the ones that are red are normally open systems. Now, it's important to note that some systems can be a combination of both of these things. So, for example, the system you see here on the right, it is a type of vertical gardening. We're using cables to grow these cucumbers up vertically. But this pot here is not only a container holding media, and we're growing in a media bed, but it also has top irrigation on top of each one of these pots. So it's kind of a combination of three things in this particular system. All right, so here's photos of the first method, Kratky system. So essentially what this is it's a container of your choice. You can choose any container. It has a stationary lid on top. The lid does not move with the water levels. You put holes in the top and put little netted hydroponic cups in, which you can buy those from anywhere. Home Depots and Lowe's have been selling them lately. I've seen them at Walmart before in the past. Again, Amazon has tons of hydroponic equipment on there too. But you would just set your cups in place, and in that reservoir, in that container, you're mixing a nutrient liquid solution. And all you're going to do is you're going to grow out a few seedlings, in this case, 4 heads of lettuce. You'll grow out your seedlings to about 3 weeks old, and then you'll put your seedlings in those netted cups, which will be touching the bottom of that liquid solution. The netted cups will be in that solution, and you'll just leave them there for 4 weeks. You do nothing else. You don't have electric running. You don't have to have running water for this, only to fill it initially, and you just leave it there. So we call this a set it and forget it system. This particular type of system is very easy to set up. You can do it for about $10. It's not difficult, very, very common beginner level system. In fact, these photos here are from one of my master gardeners who did a training about 5 years ago, a hydroponic training where they got to make these kits. She then came home and made 3 additional kits. And for 5 years now, she has in her kitchen a wire rack with shelves, and she put grow lights on them that you can get inexpensively from online. And she has these containers rotating every week. She has 4 heads of lettuce that she collects from them. And the great thing is when you use hydroponic nutrients in this for lettuce, lettuce generally requires very little nutrient, which is nice. When you mix it according to the label, most of the time you can get 3 cycles of lettuce in this type of system without having to remix the batch. So it's really nice. So she'll plop out lettuce, and as soon as she does, she puts 4 new seedlings in there, and 4 weeks later, each container has 4 new heads of lettuce for her to harvest. Very simple, very easy, and very inexpensive to use. Now, outside, you can use this system outdoors. I'm not a big fan of it outdoors in Florida because the idea of this system is that the roots that are hanging in those cups are sticking with the nutrient level. So as that nutrient level is evaporating or being absorbed by the plants, the roots are growing along with it to reach the bottom of that container as the nutrient levels go down. In Florida, because of our heat and our climate, the humidity or the evaporation level is much higher. And oftentimes we see that evaporation occur much faster than those roots can grow down to the liquid solution. So, excuse me, therefore, with this type of system, you'd want to be very wary with growing with it outdoors. Keep in mind if you are going to try it outdoors, and this goes for all plants you're growing, morning sun is always the best sun because that is when plants, if they have full sun in the morning, that's when they're going to photosynthesize. In the afternoon, if they have full sun, they will probably stop photosynthesizing because the temperature is too high. When temperatures get too high, they conserve energy and they don't photosynthesize. Well, photosynthesis is the main way that plants eat. We can provide them with nutrients all day long, but that's literally the icing on the cake for them. Their main part, the cake itself, is the photosynthesis. And the most time of day that they're going to photosynthesize is that morning sun. So morning full sun is always best. So if you can position this in a place where it gets that full morning sun, but in the afternoon it's shaded, then that would be ideal for a system like this. All right, the next one is very similar to that system. It's deep water culture. The big difference with this is that the lid is not stationary. It's floating on top of the bed, and therefore it doesn't matter how fast evaporation happens. You have that board that is floating up and down with it. So the 2 beds you see on the left, it's the same one there. This is a 4 foot by 8 foot wooden framed. It was traditionally would have been like a raised bed. So if you think of a 4 by 8 raised bed, it's built exactly the same way. The only difference is it has a pond liner that's been installed here, and then we fill it with water and we mix it with nutrients based on the volume that we have there. We use a 4 foot by 8 foot sheet of insulation, which you can get from any hardware store. And then we just use a hole saw to drill holes every square foot to put a netted cup in. And then we just put a seedling in there, a 3 to 4 week old seedling. We set it there and we leave it there for 3 to 4 weeks until it's ready to harvest. So in this case, this is a 4 by 8 board. So we had 32 heads of lettuce growing in that. But you don't have to do something this big. In fact, here at our extension gardens in Marion County, we actually have 2 beds that are only 2 foot by 4 foot. So they're much smaller and easier to manage. And you can now buy boards online that already have pre-cut holes on them from a company called Beaver Boards. In fact, they're the only company I know that create these hydroponic boards, but they do work really well, and they're specifically designed and manufactured for hydroponic production. And I want to say they're about 20 bucks a board, maybe $25 a board. So they're very inexpensive. They're not too much, and they do last for multiple years. They're not styrofoam. I can't recall the exact name of them, but they do have a protective coating on them that help them to last for many years, and they work really well for hydroponic growing. Now, the same thing can be done with any other container. So if you have another container like the photo all the way on the right, these were feed bowls that we bought at Tractor Supply or Rural King. I can't recall which ones they got those from. And essentially, they just had the same type of ordeal here. They had floating styrofoam wraps on top, and they worked really well. If you're one of those who are against using styrofoam, which I don't blame you, I know it's not the greatest of products by any means, but if you look at the 2 photos on the left, in the back of the bed, you see a blue plastic board on the ground. This is also by that company Beaver Boards. They make these. They are about probably $120 or so a board. They're very expensive, but they are continuously reusable longer than the styrofoam boards. We normally do not pick up the board like this here to harvest our lettuce. We pull 1 head of lettuce out of the board at a time. This was just to demonstrate the roots that were being grown down there and looking at those nice white healthy roots. So that's what we were looking for and demonstrating in this photo here. Somebody mentioned about oxygen in the media. So with plants like leafy greens, you don't have to have a lot of oxygen, so you don't need aeration. If you wanted to amend this type of system to be what's called deep water culture is where you actually have an aeration stone in there, because fruiting plants such as peppers, eggplants, tomatoes, things like that, they depend on that extra oxygen in order to produce fruit. So whereas leafy greens, you can get away with not having an aeration stone, you can just set it in and forget it and just leave it just like this, and they will produce tremendously. They'll do really well. And by the way, same with this system. One batch of nutrients will do 3 cycles of leafy greens in this system, so it works really well. But again, if you wanted to modify it to grow a fruiting plant in there, you can add an air stone in there. Now, the key thing with those fruiting plants, what you have to remember is if you're growing in a system like this with a raft, that raft needs to stay balanced as best as possible, and you will have to have some type of supporting system to hold up like tomato plants, for example, or peppers, like a trellis system. I do know of a teacher here in Marion County who've done a 4x8 bed like this to grow different types of peppers in, had a ton of success with it. He did not even add aeration stone, still had a lot of peppers. I'm sure his production could have been higher if he had the aeration stone in there, but he still had success with it. And he ended up using little bamboo canes that he stuck into the styrofoam, and they stayed in place. And then he used plant clips to help support the plants, and that worked really well for him. So we always say that gardening in general is trial by error. Like, even if somebody tells you, no, you can't do it this way, if you have nothing to lose, just try it out and see. As long as it's not contaminating the environment or doing anything wrong to the environment, by all means, you can certainly experience or experiment with it. So, but great question about the oxygen. All right, the next one is media bed. So this is an example at the hydroponic research facility in Live Oak. This is where they dug trenches into the ground. I believe they're about 18 to 20 inches deep by about the same width wide. And then they lined it with a landscape ground cloth fabric, an industrial one, and then filled that with a hydroponic media. In this case, they're using that composted pine bark. Again, I don't generally recommend this because every person I've talked to about composted pine bark, they have yet to be able to find a good source for where to get it from. And I know even the hydroponic research facility only knows of a single place up in the panhandle where they get it from, and that they've found it in the right consistency. But my point in showing this to you here is they are growing in this method of hydroponics where they've dug these trenches in the ground. It's all filled with a hydroponic media. You could do the same thing with coco coir or another media. And in this type of system, you could allow that coco coir to break down over time, and continuously reuse it year after year. But when they're grown in pots, I mentioned earlier, it's not reusable media. We don't normally reuse it when it's in pots, but if it's in something like this or a big raised bed, you have more room to grow. You don't have to worry about excessive root systems. You can still grow in there. So on top of these rows, I don't know if you can see in the middle picture here, there are two layers or 2 rows of black drip tape that run across there. And basically, those are all hooked to a pump, and every time the pump comes on, it waters, irrigates, and also provides nutrients from there. And so in this case, they are trialing growing different spinach varieties. And this ended up being a very successful trial. They actually, now there's a 6-acre greenhouse up in this part of Florida that grows spinach, I believe, for Publix. And they do it using this method hydroponically, which is really cool. If you want to do a smaller scale version of this or not as much work, you can see the photo on the right. These are the earth boxes. I think Lowe's, they call them patio plickers, I believe. But basically, there is a poly pipe that runs down the center of those boxes. You can kind of see it there at the bottom. It's a blue and white poly pipe. And those little black hoses are attached to the poly pipe and come into the corner of each one of those boxes where it irrigates them. That's all hydroponic media in each one of those boxes. And you can see we're growing everything from kale, catnip, edible pansies, parsley, peppers, eggplant. There's all sorts of things growing in there. And this was a student project we were working with. But essentially, all that connects to that little Brute gallon trash can there, that is filled with the nutrient solution. And that pump is plugged into a timer, which is set to go off every other day for, I think, 2 minutes. So it's using very little water, very little nutrient, and it's keeping these guys hydrated, and it works really well. All right, vertical garden. So I've already shown you some photos of the towers. These are some more towers at the high school down the road. The one here in the center is at the hydroponic research facility up in Live Oak. These are like a grow tower, also called tower gardens. These are slightly different in the sense that they're technically, if you want to get technical, they are considered aero gardens, not hydroponic gardens, or excuse me, aeroponics, not aero gardens, aeroponics. And the reason for that is if you look in the center of this white pipe here, if you were to look in there, you would find that those netted cups that are hanging off the side of it, they're just hanging there and the roots are just hanging in the air. And in the center of that tube, there is a hose there that turns on every few minutes and mists all those roots with a nutrient charged solution. And anything that's excess on those roots drips off the roots and goes back down into that olive green reservoir at the bottom. And so we call that aeroponics because the roots are not submerged in any type of liquid. They're also not planted in any type of hydroponic media. They're simply just hanging there in the root or hanging there in the air. And so we call that aeroponics, which is often clumped into hydroponics. So I wanted to still show those. If you've been to any fancier restaurants that have, you probably see these set up where they are showing they're growing their own produce fresh on site. These systems are really nice. I want to say they're probably around $800 to $1,000 a piece. They're pretty expensive. You can get a single vertigo tower that's a recirculating system, or you can get a two-tower system that's non-recirculating for about $300. And they work really well. Both systems are great systems. It really just depends on how much you want to go into spending. You can also get the tower garden with lights built onto it. It's about another $1,000 on top of that. But it's a good system. It works really well. You're primarily growing leafy greens in there. With the towers, a lot of people get confused with these little corners and planting in the corners and like what can you really grow in there. I can tell you that photo you saw before, right here, these peppers, this was from 10 towers with growing only 6 plants in each tower, so a total of 60 plants. And we harvested all these 3 months after planting. So, and this is by the way, the largest size gorilla cart you can buy at Lowe's. It's really big. But I would say there's probably a good 200 bell peppers here. The lime green flavor bursts and traditional bell peppers, your purples, yellows, reds, all those. And we had to harvest all that before winter break. So this was just halfway through the year. We still had several more months of production with these plants. And this was all grown in the tower. So don't think that just because the towers have these tiny corners that you're limited to just growing like small things in there. You can still have things grow in there. We've grown tomatoes in here. The root systems of tomatoes get so large that we can only plant 4 per tower, but you can train them to cascade down and you'll get probably a good 50 to 75 tomatoes per tower very easily and very quick. So just keep that in mind too. These towers are great. And I have not trialed so much of that with the tower gardens, but I have a master gardener currently doing that at our house. So maybe in a few months we'll know something. The photo all the way on the far right is just showing how the vertigo towers have been converted into a recirculating system or into a closed system. They normally are open where they have the drain leachate pot at the bottom. In this case, they've actually put a catch pot at the bottom of those towers and connected it to a pipe where it collects the leachate and then recirculates it. So just showing how it can easily be modified. All right, the next one's our top drip system. So the photo on the far left is just a tabletop garden, also produced by the company Vertigrow. These pots are interchangeable. You can pull the pots out anytime. So if you need more space for a plant to grow, you can do so. It is a recirculating system. Your nutrients are in the container at the bottom. They come up through this blue and white line, and then they're irrigated from the top of each pot. And any excess goes into the drain spout into that white PVC pipe where it drains back into that reservoir. This is essentially a raised bed, an elevated raised bed, I always say. It's really nice, very easy to use. The photo on the right are your Dutch buckets, or they're also called Beto buckets. And in this case, I have them full of hydroponic media called Coco Core. Oftentimes we use perlite for that. But again, this is all optional. We're growing broccoli in this particular area. And those buckets have this little feature at the bottom. You can kind of see there's a reservoir built into the bottom of the bucket. So it'll hold nutrient solution in there for long term in case irrigation goes out or your electric goes out and can't water or whatnot. But then it also has a drain spout so it doesn't overfull with water and drown your roots. The photo at the top are also Dutch buckets, and you can see these, clusters of tomatoes that are growing on there, and they did really well that season. And finally, the last one is nutrient film technique. So nutrient film technique is basically where you're growing crops in a channel where you have a 24-hour a day running line of nutrients that are going through those channels. So this is completely dependent on those roots being in a nutrient solution at all times. So this is the system I told you there's very little room for failure. So if your electric goes out, the pump goes out, or one of those emitter lines are clogged, you're going to have a whole channel of lettuce die really quick. You have about 1 hour from when the water cuts off to save your crop. And what ends up happening is if you don't save them after that 1 hour, it might go 5 hours might go by and you might get the water back on and everything will perk right back up and look all normal. But when you go to take a bite of that lettuce, it's going to be very bitter. So this type of system, you're also limited on what you can grow. Now, make no mistake, a lot of industry growers love this type of system and use it. In fact, that one of the farms I referenced earlier who are growing aquaponically, they actually not only are growing aquaponically with the fish, but they also prefer to grow their lettuce in this type of system. So they're using a very complicated system already, in addition to adding fish to it also. All right, so just as a recap with soil, plant nutrients are found naturally in the soil, so you have no idea exactly what all your plant is consuming. Likewise, if there's been any type of historical leaching of any type of chemical in the ground, whether it's a plant nutrient or not, you don't know what's being absorbed by that plant. However, with hydroponics, you know 100% of what is given to that plant and what's being absorbed. Also in soil, all soils are different and can have an excess or deficiency of nutrients or have very different pH. With hydroponics, again, all that's under your control. So you are creating that environment for them. Now, with that being said, because you don't know what's already in the soil, if you're growing in the soil, you can buy fertilizers and apply that fertilizer, but keep in mind the fertilizers you generally would buy from a regular garden center are primarily going to be all-purpose fertilizers meant for landscaping. They're not meant for hydroponics. They're not going to have all 17 nutrients in that fertilizer product. So if you're growing hydroponically, you can get away with using some commercial or some generic products such as Miracle Grow for growing something like maybe lettuce or some basic leafy greens. But for most crops you're growing hydroponically, they're going to need all 17 of those plant nutrients, which means you're going to need a hydroponic fertilizer. Now, the good news is there's a lot of hydroponic fertilizers out there. They're no more expensive than the other ones, depending on what you're getting, than the traditional fertilizers. And there are more and more places that are starting to sell them. In fact, not long ago, I saw hydroponic fertilizer in Ace Hardware. So more stores are also getting them in as well. But nowadays, you can find pretty much anything online. But the key with nutrients with growing hydroponically is you must use a hydroponic fertilizer. Some examples, MaxiGrow 10514 is a generic one. Vertigrow has one that's a really good one that we use on a regular basis. There's some Dino products out there that are also, they're called Dino, DYNO, that are really good products used for hydroponics. You can find all sorts of things that are out there. The biggest thing is just making sure you follow the label, and the label is also make sure you're abiding by that. I am going to share instructions with you all for how to build your own float bed container. Not just in a raised bed like this, but I'm going to just show you everything you'll need. And then I'm sure Patricia can get that handout to you all. I'll share it with her and she can send it to you all. But it will have step-by-step instructions for the materials you will need to build a float bucket system. And you can take the same exact instructions and modify the container if you decide you want to do something bigger or different. You're welcome to do that. So the main thing is you're just going to need your container of choice, a jigsaw, a drill, hole saw bit, netted hydroponic cups, your 2-inch thick styrofoam, permanent marker, and hydroponic fertilizer. And actually, I'm not going to go over all this. I'm going to just kind of show you kind of the steps here. You can see this with a jigsaw cutting out my raft for my bucket. There it is. I'm about to use the hole saw on the drill to cut out those holes. When you position your netted cups in your lid, and this is the same for the Cracky system, you don't want the entire netted cup submerged in the water. Your plants have two different types of roots. They have your main roots that they're going to use for collecting nutrients and water, and then they're also going to have roots off to the side of the seedling. That's how they naturally grow, that are used as oxygen roots. They have to have some type of oxygen. So if you put the entire seedling underwater, I've seen many people fail just in this first step because they think that that's how it's supposed to be done. Only the very bottom, like centimeter or two of the netted cup should be in the liquid solution. The rest of the cup should be in the air. So just set your seedling in there. With the styrofoam raft, what's really nice is you have that built-in space when you put the netted cup in that the water can't come up any higher, and therefore it does not drown your seedlings, which is really nice. So this is just to demonstrate how you'd want to do it. And then you would set it in there and just stand up your nutrients. You can see how the little puddle of water looks in the bottom of the netted cup here. This is what it looks like completed in one of these food grade Lowe's buckets. You just wait. Depending on the lettuce variety, it can be 3 to 6 weeks, and you just wait. And after you harvest that, your nutrient solution should be good for another 3 cycles, or excuse me, another 2 cycles. And then this is kind of what it looks like at the end. You can pull that whole raft out. You can cut your head of lettuce out if you want and clean the netted cups out individually. Um, we just pull the cups out and wash them with Dawn soap, and then we set it right back up and put new seedlings in there immediately afterwards. So very simple and very easy. Let's see. And you said, where is this located at? So there's different, some of the photos here are located here in Marion County in Ocala at our extension office here at UF-IFAS Extension. And then some are at the schools in Marion County, which aren't open to the public. And then some are also up at the UF-IFAS research facility up in Live Oak. And normally if you give them a call or so, if you want to come take a tour, I doubt that they would have a problem with making time to show you around or so. But they do have an open day to the public, I believe, once a year where they invite folks to come out and see what they're doing. Yep, the floating beds are all kept outside. I think we have some in a greenhouse now in Marion County and one of the schools, and they do just fine out there, but almost all of them have always been outside. Never had to spray pesticides on them. But mind you, we are generally growing a quick leafy green crop in those. The one teacher I knew who grew the peppers, and I believe he still does that regularly, he's never told me he's had to use pesticides on them. Now, I would imagine with them being outdoors and being more exposed, and being a long-term crop, he's probably run into pest issues with that. So I would say just prepare for that. But you can certainly do every one of these that I've showed you. You can do all of them outdoors. So you don't have to have them indoors. You don't have to have them in a greenhouse. They can all be done outside. Let's see. Oh, great question about the rain. So that's a question we normally get. So I'm glad you asked that. So folks don't realize that when plants absorb the nutrient solution, they absorb water faster than they do nutrients. So actually your nutrient solution becomes more concentrated over time. So when it rains, it actually brings your nutrient solution back to where you started, or around to where you started. So normally it's not a problem. Remember, when you're initially mixing it, as long as you're following the instructions of the fertilizer label, you're not using more fertilizer than you should, you're doing it exactly the way it should, then you don't have to worry about it. That rain is going to only bring it back up to where you initially mixed it. The rafts are, what's really nice about those is that when you get that rain, it brings them right to the top, but it does not overflow it. I know what you're thinking with the rain. I've lived in Florida my entire life, and I've been doing these float hydroponics for the past 12 years now probably, and have been through excessive rains. I've even left them out during hurricanes. Probably not recommended, but I have. Unfortunately, I've not had too much damage by any means, but I've never had an issue with anything growing. And people always ask about mosquitoes too. It's not a problem. You will not have mosquitoes. They do not like living in the nutrient solution, so you don't have to worry about that. Now, if you start seeing mosquito larvae or something in there, your nutrient solution is probably weakened significantly, and you probably need to clean out your system and restart, because generally they do not like living in there. I have seen tadpoles. People always say, well, that's why you didn't have mosquitoes. I don't always see tadpoles. I have seen them before, and I used to joke around. This was back when I was at the schools. If you saw six-legged frogs jumping around, it did not come from our system. But anyhow, but I'd only seen that 1 year, or actually 2 years, excuse me. And it was always in one particular bed for some reason, but not the other 8. We had 9 beds total. So, but yeah, just keep that in mind. You don't have to worry about that in terms of mosquitoes or the water. And with, especially with the floating systems. With the cracky systems where that lid is stationary, I would be checking that every single day. I would be lifting the lid off, seeing if my roots are dripping water and putting it right back in. If I feel like the water's getting too low, I'd add water. You can add water anytime you want if you feel like it's getting low. In the floating beds, I think in the 12 years I've been doing this, I've only had to add water to one of the buckets one time. And that's because it was hot of summer and I was seeing what they could grow. I should also mention with the beds, let me go back to these here. 1 year, and again, this is not based on a research study or anything. This is just based on my personal experience and what my theory is on it. 1 year at the end of the school year, we had a couple trays full of lettuce seedlings. We would grow lettuce seedlings for all the schools, not just the school I was working at. And we had a huge excess left, and the students were like, what do we do with these? Should we just throw them in compost? And I said, no, I'll be here over the summer. Just go throw them in the float beds. We had 9 float beds like this, 32 holes in each one. I said, just go throw them in the float beds, and whatever's left, just plant them, in the raised bed next to it. And so they did exactly as I asked them to do. And I had forgotten all about them because our float beds were behind our greenhouse. So I never really went behind the greenhouse unless I was going to dump barrels of compost out. So I'd forgotten all about them over the summer. Well, one day I'm there, it's mid-July, it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon or so. I'm going to the back of the greenhouse. I go out the back door, and there's 9 beds full of beautiful, huge heads of red leaf lettuce. And I had forgotten all about them. And I mean, they're full size. And in the raised beds that are literally about 20 feet away from them, the same exact lettuce, all sown at the same time and planted at the same time, had all gone to bolt and had started to flower. Well, if you're familiar with leafy greens, when they go to bolt, which means when they go to flower, it means that the leaves are bitter. So you can still eat them. They're just not going to be very flavorful and they're going to be bitter. So I was like, well, that's very interesting. How are the leaves here, or how are the lettuce here not bolting, but all the same plants bolting over in the raised bed? And here we are in the middle of summer, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It's got to be 90 degrees outside. And I go to dip my hand in the water solution, the nutrient solution, and it felt like a spring. I mean, it felt nice and insulated. My theory to that is I think because of the thickness of the lumber, as well as that 2-inch sheet of insulation on top, it really kept the nutrient solution nice and cold. And I had just learned at the IFAS research facility, they found that in growing in these NFT systems like this, when they hook a water fountain chiller to the nutrient reservoir for this system and they run the water while it's chilled, they can actually grow in the system 6 to 8 weeks longer into summer because it keeps the lettuce from bolting. So therefore, my theory ever since then has been that the reason the lettuce can grow like this in these raised beds over the summer is because of that cooler water that was maintained in there because of the thickness of the lumber and everything. So I could be wrong on that, not sure. But I did want to share that. I've tried that since with the buckets. That's why I had it growing in the summer just to see if it would do the same. They all went to bolt. That was also the same bucket. I had to add water solution or more water to it. But yeah, so just something you can do. I just wouldn't recommend doing it over the summer. I'm going to end really quick. These are photos of those raft system being used in industry. So growing large quantities of lettuce in industry for folks. This is how they do that. And this is happening all over the world like this. Some home systems you can do on your own. I'm more than happy to share some of these things with you if any of you want some ideas. Here's a whole bunch of carrots that we grew in a raised bed. It's a 12-foot long raised bed by 1 foot wide by 1 inches or 12 inches deep. It's filled with play sand. We're growing all these carrots in there. And in this case, in the photo on the far left, we're also growing beets and other rooted plants in there. And then finally, I'll end with this. If you are really getting into hydroponics and you really want to learn more, this book on the left, DIY Hydroponic Gardens by Tyler Barris. I apologize for it being blurry. He is an alumni of University of Florida. He, I believe, now lives in California or Colorado. He is phenomenal. He is this book is the best hydroponic books I've ever come across. All fully colored photos with things you can do on your own. It's an absolute amazing system. He's written this other book on the right. This is if you become obsessed with it and want to turn all your furniture in your house into a hydroponic system, you can totally do that too. But the one on the left is very practical. It's great, super easy. The photos are great. He has videos online that go along with what he's teaching in the book. And he does essentially the same thing that the UFIFAS hydroponic research facility does. He is paid by companies all over the world to trial out new hydroponic systems and new seeds in his big, ginormous greenhouse he has over in the West Coast. So anyhow, I encourage you to check out that book. I think you'd really enjoy it. And with that, I'll end. I apologize. I know I'm a little over.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. We appreciate it. I think we had one question that came in earlier was what kind of pH monitor do you use and how would you elevate the pH in a hydroponic system?
Great question. So you can buy simple little pH kits that you use if you want. To me, they're not the most effective. They do have pH pens, like one in particular I like is called Blue Lab. It's a Blue Lab pen. It can do your pH and your electric conductivity if you want to test that. Oftentimes, hobbyist systems, you don't, unless you're really getting into hydroponics, most people don't start doing all those things. It's a little technical, but as you master it, it's something you can become more productive in terms of your produce by paying attention to those things. So the Blue Lab pen is a very good option. I think it's probably around 70 bucks or so. But again, you can find significantly cheaper things online to use and you can test those things. And then again, there's different products you can buy that's inexpensive to elevate or lower pH, and you can just keep those and store them as needed. So yeah, and I think I did see another question that said, about adding water. You can totally add water if you want. Most of the time, I haven't had to. It's only been with that one bucket that I ever had to add water to. Your water levels will go down and stuff a little bit, and that's okay as long as your plants aren't being completely covered by the sides of your container. In that case, I would add some water, excuse me, to elevate the raft itself to bring it higher to get more access to sunlight.
How about what advice do you have for propagating the starter seedlings, especially if you're seeking to be self-sufficient?
Yeah, so for me personally, I was raised I was taught by UFIFAS Hydroponic Research Facility that it's always best to grow out seedlings first and then transplant them to finish out in the hydroponic system. So rarely do we ever plant seeds directly into the hydroponic system. You can totally do that. In fact, most hobbyist hydroponic growers I know and home scale hydroponic growers, that's what they do because it's so much easier to do that than to grow them out as seedlings. But when you're growing in a commercial standpoint, you want everything to be consistent because it's time, it's money, everything else. I have found that I like to transplant the seedlings, and I've learned how to grow seedlings just because of my history and my work that I've done. So I always grow them out just in like regular cell trays, and you can either do it in a hydroponic media, or a lot of folks will actually start off growing their seedlings out in soil, and then when they reach that stage of finishing, they'll switch them over to a hydroponic system and finish them out hydroponically. In fact, some commercial growers do that as well, and they can still sell their product as a hydroponic product, even though it traditionally started in a soil cell, if that makes sense.
Any fertilizer that you recommend?
My favorite ones are MaxiGrow All Purpose, Vertigrow All Purpose. Vertigrow is actually based here in Marion County, and they're awesome. And then the other one, which I have not used in years, I'm pretty positive is called Dino, Dyno, and they have a generic one as well. But I've honestly have had so much success with the other two. With all of my systems, they're all purpose, and they also sell specific ones too. So if you're specifically trying to grow strawberries or tomatoes, some of your major crops, they'll sell specific fertilizer recipes that are better for them. So, but I normally stick with all purpose and it's always been great.
Okay. And the last question that I saw is, let's see, is your floating bed system kept outside?
Yep, they're all outside, and I go through about 3 cycles of growing in those, and then I wash them out. The liners that we use for that, you can if you Google hydroponic liners, I think it's the first place. There's a new place that is on there that you can buy by the square footage. You used to not be able to do that. You used to have to buy like a 300-foot roll, but this new company allows you to buy by the square footage for very inexpensive, and we just bought some from them. We've been using it for probably about almost a year now, and they've been fantastic. We have not had to replace them or anything, so they've been great.
And last question before we can sign off. When it rains, does that dilute the solution?
Nope, yeah. So when it rains outside, it actually brings your solution up back to where you started, essentially, because when you mix your solution, you put your plants in there, the plants are going to absorb the water faster than they will the nutrients. So your nutrient solution is actually going to become more concentrated over time. And so when you add more water to it, it actually kind of brings it back to the level you originally started with. And of course, when in doubt, like if you feel like, maybe we have had excessive rains and you feel like, okay, I know there's more or there's not enough nutrients or I'm seeing yellowing leaves. At the end of the day, just take that and go use that solution in your landscape plants. Go give them a little boost or so because it's already watered down from there and it's already a weakened solution from there, especially if you followed the label to mix it, and just start a new batch and just start over if you need to. Very simple and very easy.
Okay, well, that is it for the questions. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for the information. Is there anything else you would like to add before we sign off?
I would just say like hydroponics is really fun and it's addicting. And if you have ever grown traditionally or if you're into traditional gardening, I promise you, if you give hydroponics a try, and I'm not saying to not do traditional gardening, I love that too. But if you give hydroponics a try, you probably will not ever go back because you get your crops so much faster. It's so much easier, less pest pressure, less weeds, less, I mean, everything. It just is so much easier and it's affordable, and you're also conserving water, conserving the amount of fertilizer you're having to use. So it's a win-win all across the board. And it's fun. It's a relevant way of growing, and you don't need as much space, and it's inexpensive. So, But yeah, I would say give it a try. And if you have any questions, I have a whole group of master gardeners who are also getting into it just like I am. I've kind of taken them under my wing and they've gotten all into it. And I have a master gardener who's addicted to it now too. And so, I mean, but they love it. And so we have a group of us here that will gladly help. Emails, calls, texts, anything you need to do to our office, we'll be more than happy to help you.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy, and thank you
Of
everyone
course.
for attending today's webinar. It will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, and I posted the link to that on the chat. So thank you, everybody, and have a good rest of your day, y'all.
All right.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.